In Germany, it's known as the fiscal bazooka, a defense spending package so explosive that it'll detonate the old national order. Voted through the outgoing Bundestag on March the 18th, the bazooka seeks to unlock $500 billion in spending on national infrastructure and the green transition. But for viewers of this channel, it's that second part of the package that matters. With a constitutional amendment that allows defense spending to be exempted from strict debt laws, the vote stands to unlock a surge in German military power, unseen since 1945. While precise details are pending, there's talk that the CDU wing of the incoming coalition government wants to hike defense spending all the way to 3.5% of GDP. If that happens, it will be the single most transformative moment in European defense in decades, a decision that will set Germany on the path to becoming a global military power. But you've likely already noticed the key part of that description: if it happens. Because as we are about to see, even turning on the money taps won't guarantee that Germany becomes a defense superpower. While the fiscal bazooka may help blast obstacles out of Berlin's path, the road ahead remains incredibly hard-going. And whether Germany makes it to the end or not, that's going to have enormous implications not just at home, but for the whole of Europe. For the BBC, it was a seismic shift. The Financial Times declared that it could jolt the Eurozone's largest economy out of years of stagnation. But perhaps the biggest hype came from the Wall Street Journal journalist Bojan Pansevsky, who declared on X that this is the single most important thing that has happened or will happen regarding defense and Ukraine in Europe. The cause of all this hyperbole? The vote that took place during an emergency session of Germany's Bundestag on March the 18th. On that day, 512 MPs, over a two-thirds majority, backed a constitutional amendment that would reform the nation's debt brake. Introduced under Angela Merkel in 2009, the brake fixed annual structural deficits at 0.35% of GDP. While the March vote didn't get rid of it, it did create two important exceptions. The first was to create a special €500 billion fund for infrastructure investment over the next decade. The second, more important change was to exempt defense spending over 1% of GDP from debt brake restrictions. An exemption that would also include any military aid sent to, quote, states attacked in violation of international law, a clear reference to Ukraine. As The Economist noted, these reforms will now likely lead to, quote, the biggest fiscal expansion in Germany's post-war history. The backgrounds for this surge in spending will be familiar for anyone even vaguely following the news. Donald Trump's return to power has upended the transatlantic relationship with all the force of a NASCAR rally crashing into a Bratwurst convention. NATO unity has been questioned. The leader of a European nation under attack publicly berated in the White House. Overtures made to Russia. Peace talks on Ukraine held to which European nations weren't even invited. While analysts can debate whether President Trump's actions are justified, the key point is that from a European perspective, it almost doesn't matter. Nations like Germany believe America is about to throw the entire post-war order on the continent under a Putin-shaped bus, and that means drastic action is required. You can see this shift in mindset just by looking at public polling. Research by the German Council on Foreign Relations shows that a public once wary of increased defense spending now actively supports it. As IP Quarterly notes, quote, 75% of Germans and backers of all parties represented in the new Bundestag think it is necessary that the EU's member states increase defense spending. This includes 66% of voters for the far-left Die Linke party and even 57% of voters for the far-right AfD, two parties with leadership that explicitly want to block increased military spending. In fact, the desire by Die Linke and AfD to block the fiscal bazooka is what led to one of the most controversial parts of March's vote. After elections on February 23rd, the new parliament gives the two parties a blocking minority that would make constitutional amendments impossible. But by a quirk of German politics, the old parliament continued to sit for a short while after the elections. So, rather than wait for the new parliament to be seated, the centre-right CDU, the centre-left SPD, and the Greens teamed up to ram their charges through the outgoing Bundestag, where AfD and Die Linke were helpless to stop it. This was both controversial, but also amusingly ironic. Prior to the election, the CDU under Friedrich Merz repeatedly snubbed attempts by outgoing SPD Chancellor Olaf Scholz to reform the debt brake. It was only after the CDU topped the polls that Merz did a complete 180. For some, this was a sign that Merz is about as trustworthy as a talking snake offering you a delicious apple. For others, it was a sign of just how totally the return of Trump had upended European politics. As the Financial Times wrote, quote, Merz has justified his U-turn by pointing to the dramatic deterioration of the transatlantic relationship under Donald Trump, who has been rushing to reach a peace settlement with Vladimir Putin over Ukraine without initially consulting EU-NATO allies. Whatever the truth behind Merz's motivations, the fact is that Germany is now in a position to spend on defense like never before. Yet, even with the debt break off and Merz seemingly determined to floor the gas, one awkward question does remain: will it be enough? Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. Although the German spending package has been touted as being worth 1 trillion euros in the press, the reality at the time of writing is that we still don't know exactly how much will be spent. As the likely incoming chancellor, Merz is pushing to raise defense spending to 3.5% of GDP, but Politico reports that his coalition partners, the SPD, so far have balked at the figure. There are historic reasons for this timidity. Were Germany to commit to the figure of 3.5%, it would be transformed in an instant into one of the world's top military spenders. For those used to hearing of Germany as a laggard in defense, that might be surprising. But it really just highlights the sheer size of the German economy, the third largest on the planet. In 2023, Berlin allocated a miserly 1.5% of GDP to defense matters, yet still managed to break into the global top 10 of military spenders in pure dollar terms, far ahead of more militarized societies like Poland or Israel. Among European nations, only the UK and Ukraine spent more, and then only by a few $1 billion, at the cost of 2.3% of Britain's GDP and an eye-watering 36.7% of Ukraine's. If Germany, in its deadbeat moocher mode, is still one of the world's top military spenders, then a Berlin that annually plows 3.5% of GDP into defense will leapfrog every nation except the United States and China and draw more or less equal with Russia. One model predicts that hitting the target will unlock an extra 600 billion euros across 10 years. The good news is that 600 billion euros is above and beyond the 400 billion euros the FT reports the country needs to deter Russia from attacking. The bad news is the military spending isn't a static thing. If you neglect your defense sector for decades, you can't just switch the money pump back on and expect it to be back where you were when you started cutting. And Germany has been underfunding its military for a hell of a long time. Here are some figures. In 1989, just before the end of the Cold War, West Germany was spending 2.53% of its GDP on defense. By 1992, that figure had dropped below 2%. It wouldn't reach over 2% again until 2024. Nor was this similar to the way that France also dropped below 2%, but kept bumping along at 1.9 or 1.8%. At its lowest point, in 2005, German defense spending was a mere 1.1% of GDP. And that neglect has had massive knock-on effects. Last September, the Kiel Institute released a report into the deep impacts of cuts on German military spending. The decline was startling. From over 430 fighter jets at the dawn of the new millennium, the Bundeswehr had been reduced to just 226. From nearly 2,400 main battle tanks, the number had dropped to a mere 339. Look at any significant piece of hardware, and the sums are similar. In 2004, Germany could field almost 1,000 artillery pieces. Today, it can muster slightly over 100. Berlin's forces once commanded over 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles. Now there are fewer than 700. Air defense systems too were missing, in this case, because they've been donated to Ukraine and not yet replaced. And military infrastructure is in such poor shape that it should be a national scandal. When the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Armed Forces released her annual report last year, she noted that many of the 1,500 properties the Bundeswehr owns were in, quote, a disastrous state. Highlights include barracks that were water damaged and soldiers forced to sleep in mold-infested quarters. The cost of simply getting all the barracks in the country up to a reasonable standard is estimated to be 67 billion euros, a sum that would eclipse France's entire annual military budget. As the Kiel report summed up its findings, quote, after decades of military downsizing, German military spending is woefully inadequate to meet the new strategic challenge posed by Russia. This is the crux of the problem. While a cash injection of the scale that Merz is planning is more than enough to turn Germany into a military colossus, the impact of decades of underinvestment means that the time horizon required is relatively long. Sadly, a long time horizon is exactly what Germany doesn't have. In the east, Russia is attempting to rearm at a dizzying rate. While its forces are currently bogged down in Ukraine, the ceasefire, especially if combined with the lifting of sanctions, could see Putin freed up to invest spectacular sums in his war machine. And that could leave Berlin in an incredibly dangerous spot. If you spend long enough reading about the Ukraine war online, you'll eventually encounter some version of the following argument. Western countries are claiming that Russia is underperforming and losing insane amounts of men and material in Ukraine, but they're also claiming that Russia is an existential threat to Europe. Both can't be true at once. Now, although that argument does seem neat, it falls apart the moment it comes into contact with logic. Because, of course, both things can be true at once. Just as America losing the Vietnam War didn't mean that no country ever needed to fear Uncle Sam's military again, so too, Russia's humiliation in Ukraine doesn't mean the Kremlin isn't capable of sparking a Europe-wide inferno. The Bruegel think tank puts some firmer numbers on this. In a September report, they wrote that, quote, Russia's defense budget is estimated to amount to more than 30% of the Russian federal budget, i.e. at least $120 billion. When adjusted for differences in prices between Russian and US defense, Russian defense spending is estimated at the equivalent of around $400 billion annually. According to the authors, this means that, quoting again, Russia's substantial resources make it possible for it to scale up the forces fighting in Ukraine and create new reserve armies that can eventually be deployed in Ukraine or elsewhere. And the or elsewhere part of that sentence is key there, because if they deploy to fight in Europe, then Germany will struggle to help. To quote the Kiel Institute report, Russia is radically increasing its capacity to produce armaments, including advanced systems, and is now in a position to produce as many weapons in 6 months as all of Germany's armed forces currently field. The likelihood of the Kremlin opening a second front against NATO while still being bogged down in Ukraine is, to be clear, extremely low. But the worry is that Moscow will take any ceasefire as a chance to pour even more money into its military, then attack in 5 to 8 years with a completely reconstituted, massively upgraded army. Although that may sound like a long time, it's almost nothing in military terms. As the Bruegel report authors write, our findings do not suggest that Germany will be ready to provide the deterrence that is expected from it should Russia decide to confront NATO in 5 to 8 years. To be fair, this report was written before the recent vote to reform the debt brake, but it highlights issues that will plague any German rearmament plan. The first is ammunition production. While Rheinmetall is opening new plants, Berlin still can't compete with Moscow in terms of shells or rockets. At 2024 fire rates along Ukraine's front lines, the Kiel report estimates that Germany would burn through a year's worth of ammunition production in a little over 2 months. And that's if it had anything to fire them with. Because they were forged in peacetime, Germany's military procurement processes are legendarily slow. In 2022, DW reported that procuring new helmets for parachutists had taken over 10 years, thanks in part to testing designed to ensure the foreign-made helmets, quote, fit on German heads. Although, just one example, it's representative of the utter nightmare doing even basic stuff has become in the Bundeswehr. Using the current procurement system, the Kiel report estimates that it would take Germany a century to buy enough howitzers to bring its capabilities back up to 2004 levels. With numbers like that, the mere 40 years it would take to procure 2,000 tanks seems like a bit of a breeze, doesn't it? And these are just systems the Bundeswehr already has. For other stuff critical to fighting a modern war, Berlin's effectively blind. Take drones. A mere 1,800 kilometers from Berlin, Ukraine and Russia are both developing drones at a vastly accelerated pace. Drones that tip burning thermite from the sky in a rain of fire. Drones piloted by ultra-thin fiber optic cables so they're immune to jamming. So high-tech have the two nations' drones become that recent estimates suggest they cause 70% of all battlefield fatalities. But Germany not only lacks cheap offensive drones, it would also require years to procure them. Drone defense systems, too, are nowhere to be seen. Less visible, but no less important, cyber capabilities are also thin on the ground in the Bundeswehr. The hope is that some of the money in the fiscal bazooka will go into funding the newly upgraded Cyber and Information Space Command, but we'll have to wait and see. As The Economist has noted, one of the biggest challenges is, quote, how to use rearmament funds wisely. But it's not just in Germany itself that the money's impact will have to be carefully measured. There's also the question of what it will do to the rest of Europe. As Europe's largest economy, anything Germany does has ripple effects across the entire bloc. And that includes firing a gigantic fiscal bazooka. As a recent Financial Times headline declared, Germany's spending push drives up borrowing costs across Eurozone. Because it's so economically powerful, Germany's debt functions as a de facto benchmark for the entire bloc. So when a massive surge in spending pushes up Bund yields, it does the same for other nations. And that's a problem, because unlike Germany, other major European countries already have high borrowing costs that are now getting pushed even higher. As Reuters explains, borrowing costs in Italy, France, and Spain have mostly matched the 20 basis point rise in benchmark Germany, the bloc's largest economy, since it agreed on a historic debt rule overhaul. And this matters because the recent EU plan to juice defence spending across the continent by 800 billion euros mostly relied on tweaks to borrowing rules that would have allowed countries to take on more debt, provided it was used to fund defence. Now, that's still the plan. But Fitch Ratings believes that the rise in borrowing costs brought on by Germany's bazooka will severely cut into that headroom. Rather than 800 billion euros, the EU as a whole may wind up spending only 500 billion. In this scenario, France's defence outlays will max out at 2.5% of GDP, while Italy's won't even breach 2%. Although it is worth noting that this isn't the only negative scenario in play here. Using modelling by hedge fund Point72, the FT suggests that France's debt-to-GDP ratio could rise from 115% to 122%, while Italy's could cross the 150% mark. The upshot is that while Germany uses its spending splurge to rearm, the effect across the wider bloc could be to dampen defence spending, aka the exact opposite of what Europe really wants to achieve. However, we should be clear that this is only one set of potential outcomes, one focused on the negatives. But there's also a case to be made that the spillover effects could be more positive. That's especially the case in Italy. Although spending costs for Rome may already be rising, they could be more than offset by potential economic growth. The reason is that northern Italy's manufacturing base is deeply integrated with Germany's, and with demand likely to be red hot for new military kit, Italian factories can expect vast new orders from Berlin. This is the outcome that Italy's Minister for Industry, Adolfo Urso, told the FT he is counting on. Likewise, something similar could play out for France, which is home to several world-class defence companies. Such positive spillover is the outcome Goldman Sachs predicted in a recent forecast. Following the announcement of the fiscal bazooka, the group raised its growth forecasts for the Eurozone. As their memo noted, quote, "One reason is that we expect stronger growth in Germany to spill over into neighbouring countries. Another reason is that we now expect the rest of the euro area to step up military spending somewhat more quickly in response to the German announcement." And this second part could be key. While the Baltic states and Poland have been ramping up defence spending since the beginning of Russia's invasion, and states like the UK have pledged more spending since Trump's return to power, many other European countries are likely to wait to follow Germany's lead. If they see Berlin spending big on military, they may be encouraged to follow suit. Signs are that this might already be happening. On the 26th of March, about a week after the German vote, Sweden announced it would increase defence spending by 3.5% of GDP by 2030. Shortly after, on April the 1st, Finland announced a hike to 3% by 2029. As President Alexander Stubb wrote on X, "This is a part of Finland's contribution to Europe taking greater responsibility for our own defence." The best-case scenario would be that this triggers a domino effect, one that sees governments pumping money into arms manufacturers across the continent. In a report speaking to industry insiders, The Economist noted that, quoting here, "The current bottleneck is not so much manufacturing capacity as a dearth of big orders from governments. Some firms are not challenged at all to their maximum capacity." This is backed up by research from the Bruegel think tank, which told the magazine that, quoting again, "This comes down to the political will to put through orders rather than industrial problems. Europe could massively ramp up production of critical systems in 2 years if enough orders were placed." Now, of course, political will is a difficult thing to overcome, and there are already signs that not all EU states are rising to the challenge. Over in Spain, the government of Pedro Sanchez seems determined to fake its way into NATO's good books. While Madrid currently spends a pathetic 1.28% of GDP on defence, Sanchez recently announced a plan to reclassify attempts to cut carbon emissions as military expenditure, since his government believes climate change is a bigger threat to Spain than Russia. Needless to say, this would allow Sanchez to claim his nation is among NATO's top spenders without actually doing anything to boost readiness or help fellow Europeans unfortunate enough to live closer to Moscow. By and large, though, the hopes are that most nations will be inspired to engage in good faith efforts to juice their defense industrial bases and thus raise European growth overall. Yet for all the potential good news on the financing side of things, there's one major problem Germany will still need to overcome if it wants to become a military giant: manpower. Since 2018, the Bundeswehr's official goal has been to have 203,000 active troops in place by 2030. Well over halfway to the deadline, and Berlin isn't even close to hitting the target. Lackluster recruitment and high dropout rates mean that German troop numbers remain stubbornly stuck at around 181,000. And those who are serving are getting older. As CNN reports, the average age of German servicemen and women is 34. It wasn't always like this, though. During the Cold War, West Germany had 500,000 active duty soldiers, with 800,000 more in reserve. Conscription kept a steady stream of fresh young faces pouring in. Today, though, the reserve force has reduced to a rump of just 60,000, and conscription hasn't been the law of the land since it was ended in 2011. And that's important because without necessary troop numbers, it doesn't matter how much you spend on kit. Unless you can back your high-tech military up with manpower, you'll only ever have a hollow army. In the context of modern geopolitics, it gets even more urgent. Should American forces completely withdraw from Europe, the Bertelsmann Foundation estimates that Germany alone would need to field 270,000 active duty troops with another 260,000 in reserve to make up the credibility gap. Yet there's little evidence that that's going to be possible. For one thing, there's the lack of appetite among Germans to actually fight a war. In 2023, Gallup found a mere 23% of Germans answered yes to the question, if there was a war that involved your country, would you be willing to fight for your country? By way of comparison, the share of Poles who answered yes was almost double at 45%. Now, that was 2 years ago, when Germans could assume that any war on European soil would involve NATO and the USA swooping in to save them. Signs are that attitudes have shifted since then. A recent YouGov poll found that 58% of Germans, for example, support reintroducing conscription. Crucially, though, the incoming government seems to have little appetite for such a move. While Merz favours a form of one-year conscription that allows non-military options, the Bundeswehr is clear that it couldn't handle an annual influx of tens of thousands of young Germans. Not that the Bundeswehr seems to have much grasp on young people in general. The BBC recently reported on a visit to their drop centre in Berlin, which we can only describe as cringe. Quoting, "The Bundeswehr only has one permanent drop-in centre, a small unit sandwiched between a pharmacy and a shoe store beside Berlin's Friedrichstrasse station. With camouflage-clad dummies in the window and slogans like, 'Cool and spicy,' it aims to attract men and women to serve, but it only gets a handful of coolers each day." And this is a problem we see time and time again in the Western world, an inability to bring in enough new soldiers. Britain is going through a similar recruitment crisis, while the US is just emerging from one that lasted years, and even now the American military is suffering extraordinary dropout rates. Exactly what's causing this recruitment crisis could easily be the subject of an entire video. As far as this one is concerned, though, it raises the worrying spectre of a Bundeswehr that's flush with cash, but without anyone to man the gear it's spending those euros on. And really, this may be the biggest problem that Germany faces in its plan to become a military superpower: the unwillingness of its own people to pick up arms. Still, we don't want to end on an unnecessarily bleak note here, because while Berlin's drive to become a serious defense player is littered with obstacles, at least Germany's finally doing something. For much of the last 3 years, the story out of Germany has been a government that makes promising sounds on defense and then dithers or obfuscates or just plain fails to do anything. Well, with the incoming change of government, Berlin at last seems ready to become the leader much of Europe wants it to be, to stand up against Russian aggression in the east and provide the financial muscle needed to kickstart a European defense revolution. Will it succeed? Well, we're not going to know for several years, but at least the Germans are now trying to play their part. What that means for the future is something we'll just have to wait to find out.